If you've been keeping up with the Varka leaks, you know his kit is kind of a mess at the moment. He's probably the most controversial character Genshin Impact has dropped in a while in terms of his strength during the beta. And with his V3 beta update already out of the way and not changing much, things aren't looking too good for Varka. But is he truly doomed? Or is there still a way to save Varka? Let's discuss what it is about Varka's kit and team that's holding him back, and what I think Hoyo would need to do in order to make Varka on par with the current standards for a good DPS. But first, a word from the sponsor of today's video. LD Shop is a safe and reliable top-up site that allows you to buy currency across multiple different games, including Honkai Star Rail, Genshin Impact, among other games. They offer prices at a discount, from anywhere up to 13% to 25% cheaper than topping up in-game. Not only are the prices cheaper, but they make topping up completely effortless. All you need is your server and game ID, and you're good to go. No hassle at all, and no personal information required whatsoever. After purchase, you can see that the Jades are sent to my account within 5 minutes. There are no downsides to using LD Shop for your purchases, as the prices on LD Shop are strictly better than the prices in-game. But the upsides don't stop there. Users who register using my link in the description below will get an exclusive 15% and 5% coupon, which can save you up to $50. Additionally, if you spend $80 in total, you can earn an Express Supply Pass for completely free. If you want to top up at discounted prices with no downsides, using a website and method that has been approved as safe by multiple large content creators in the space, then click the link in the description below to head over to LD Shop and start saving money on your gacha game top-ups right away. If you aren't familiar with what Varka does, his playstyle is very simple and can be compared to Wanderer, where you press your skill to enter an enhanced state. From there, you basically spam normal attacks and occasionally weave in Varka's enhanced charge attack whenever it comes off cooldown. There's a bit more nuance in terms of how his normal attacks reduce the cooldown of his enhanced charge attack, but it doesn't change the fact that he can only get 2 enhanced charge attacks during his rotation. Otherwise, he's just spamming normal attacks, similarly to Wanderer. His burst is also similar to Wanderer in that it's not an important part of his rotation, and you just use it whenever you have it up without really building around it. So, with such a simple playstyle, Varka is a character who is completely carried by his numbers. Unfortunately, his numbers aren't carrying him. He's performing well below the current top tier DPSs, such as the Nodcry trio of Flynn's, Nefer, and Zibai, as well as underperforming compared to many of the other top tier DPSs, such as Mavika, Skirk, and Varesa. But there is more to Varka's issues beyond just having low damage. First off is his team building restrictions. Varka requires 1 other Anemo unit on the team, as well as 2 other units who share an element with each other in order to activate his talent that gives him most of his damage. On top of this, Anemo DPSs are already working with a disadvantage due to not having access to any amplifying reactions. This isn't inherently an issue, since Hoyo can just balance their numbers around the fact that they have no amplifying reactions, like they did with Skirk. They've just undertuned Varka's numbers while restricting his team building. Now, I will say, while Varka's team building is restrictive, Varka's kit itself is designed to be flexible. He can infuse his normal attacks with any element, depending on the elements of his teammates. Sort of like Chaska, except without any RNG involved. This means Varka is able to handle many different enemy encounters with different elemental checks because of his ability to change his element depending on his teammates. Or at least, that should be the case. And that's probably Hoyo's thought process behind designing his kit. His flexibility is part of his power budget, and therefore, his overall damage is lower than the damage of the other top tier DPSs because he can essentially change his element for whatever fight he needs. The problem with this is that Varka's numbers are too far behind his competition at the current moment. His best team, which is his Pyro team, consisting of Varka, Venti, Duran, and Bennett, isn't even close to performing similarly to the other top tier DPSs. And that means that his non-Pyro teams are even further behind, which sort of defeats the purpose of Varka's flexibility to change into different elements, when it's hardly ever worth it to actually interact with that aspect of his kit due to how far behind his damage is. But Varka's personal damage and his team restrictions aren't the only issues with Varka. There are further issues when we compare his overall team to the other top tier teams in the game as well. You see, in terms of personal damage, Varka actually isn't far off from Flynn's. Varka and Flynn's do very, very similar damage. The problem is the discrepancy in the amount of damage their teammates contribute. Inefa and Columbina do so much damage in a Flynn's team, and Inefa especially single-handedly makes up the difference between Flynn's and Varka's power levels, despite Varka doing similar personal damage to Flynn's. Venti and Duran are clearly designed to also contribute personal damage in Varka's teams, but they just don't offer anywhere near the amount of damage Inefa offers to Flynn's teams. Then, compared to hypercarries who deal the majority of the team's DPS, like Nefer and Zibai, Varka's personal damage just pales in comparison. Because of this, Varka is in a really weird spot where his personal damage is similar to a character like Flynn's, who isn't a hypercarry and relies on his teammates' damage to make up a large portion of his team DPS. But Varka's teammates are not able to make up for his lower personal damage the way Flynn's team is able to. Thus, Varka ends up falling behind all the others. So, what does Varka need in order to catch up to the other carries? is. Does Hoyo need to just super buff his damage numbers so that he can keep up? Well, no, not necessarily. Because again, his personal damage is already matching Flynn's. Theoretically, Varka could get a new teammate who synergizes so well with the rest of his team that they can raise the team's DPS to top tier levels without needing Varka to do insanely more damage than he's currently doing. And that's where Nicole comes in. Nicole is a pyro character, as seen by her vision and her cutscenes in-game. So she's already the perfect element to fit into Varka's best in slot team. Nicole is also a Hexencircle witch, so Hoyo would have to be the biggest trolls ever if Nicole isn't meant to synergize with other Hexarray characters. Lastly, Nicole has a decent amount of interactions with Varka in this story, and she sort of just gives me support vibes, which is not a good justification for her being a Hexarray support, but I mean, I think I am not alone when I say that I think a lot of signs are currently pointing towards Nicole being a Hexarray support who will buff Varka's teams. The only question that remains is how will Nicole buff Varka's teams to the point where he can compete with our current top tier DPSs, because she would need to be quite the hefty buff. She would also be replacing Bennett, and Bennett is Bennett. He's such a powerful unit, and he does so much for the team. So the fact that Nicole needs to be such a large increase over Bennett of all characters makes increasing Varka's team DPS a much harder task compared to, say, Columbina replacing a character like Aino, who literally did barely anything in Lunar teams aside from existing. But here's the thing, how much is Bennett actually doing for Varka teams? Bennett's attack buff is obviously very strong, but Duran can't snapshot the attack buff, so Bennett isn't buffing Duran at all. Venti needs to snapshot Bennett's buff, so you have to use Venti's skill and burst after Bennett, which means that you're losing uptime on Bennett's ultimate for Varka. So by the time Varka is getting Bennett's buff, he's only going to get around 75% of the value of it, and by the end of Varka's attack rotation, Bennett's buff has already worn off of him. All Nicole would need to do is offer a buff equivalent to Bennett's for the entire team with a much more quality of life and permanent uptime. Does this sound too broken for you? Well, let's break it down some more. What Bennett offers is upwards of 1,200 attack only to the on-field character, which is part of what makes Bennett so powerful for hypercarries, where the on-field DPS is the only one who needs to benefit from such a massive attack buff. For instance, Varka. Since Nicole's buff would be team-wide, she doesn't need to give an attack buff equal to Bennett's. Imagine she gives a 1,000 attack buff to the entire team, which is still less than Bennett. Maybe the full 1,000 attack buff is only for Hexarray characters as well, and for non-Hexarray characters, her attack buff is cut in half to 500. Still a respectable amount for a team-wide attack buff, but as you can see, it's nothing absurdly broken. This would not be nearly enough for her to replace Bennett for a character like Varka, since Bennett's attack buff is still stronger for any hypercarry team that doesn't care about buffing the off-fielders. But what this would do for Varka is it would allow Nicole to actually buff Duran's damage, which Bennett was not able to do. It would also allow Varka to get the full benefit of a Bennett level buff for Varka's entire attack rotation, while also still giving the buff to Venti, assuming Nicole has 100% uptime on her buff. In this way, Varka's personal damage actually wouldn't change all that much, therefore making his current damage numbers in the beta perfectly fine, since he's still doing very similar personal damage to Flynn's. What Nicole really brings is an increase to Duran's personal damage, since Duran is now getting majorly buffed in this team, allowing Duran and Venti's personal damage together to match Anefa's. Then, if Nicole also brings a bit of personal damage to match Columbina's damage in a Flynn's team, all of a sudden, Varka has a team that is very similar in performance to a Flynn's team. Not from buffing Varka's damage numbers any higher than they currently are, but simply from Nicole being the final puzzle piece that allows the entire team to function together in a much more synergistic way. Think of it like this. Flynn's is the main DPS with decent numbers, but it's Anefa's personal damage that really raises the team DPS, while Columbina buffs both of their damage and also provides her own personal damage. For Varka, Duran would be the Anefa, and Nicole would be the Columbina, who buffs both Varka and Duran's damage, especially Duran's damage, in order to allow the team to finally match the DPS performance of Flynn's and the other top tier carries, while Nicole also gives her own personal damage. The best part is that Nicole would be accomplishing all of this without having a restrictive kit, because Nicole's synergy with Duran would automatically make the two of them a very similar wheelchair core as Columbina and Anefa, giving Nicole a ton of teams that she can slot into, especially Chevreuse teams with electro carries like Varessa and Clorinde. Meanwhile, Nicole also is not breaking the game because she's still not better than Bennett for hypercarries who don't care about buffing the off-fielders, such as Varka, who would much prefer Bennett's higher attack buff for only the on-fielder. Give Nicole some form of sustain at the same time, such as making her a healer or a shielder, especially given how important shielding feels for Varka, so he doesn't get interrupted, and this would give Nicole even more team flexibility. The reason I also think Nicole could deal off-field damage similar to Duran is for balance reasons. First off, it would obviously help the Varka team compete with the Flynn's team even more, since Duran's damage alone probably still isn't going to reach Anefa levels, but Duran plus Nicole's own personal damage theoretically would be able to. But also, the fact that Nicole buffs Duran so much runs the risk of a very funny scenario occurring, where Duran ends up being a better on-field DPS than Varka. This is already the case, where Duran does more damage as an on-fielder than Varka, and so you're literally better off just using Varka's own sub-DPS Duran, as an on-fielder instead of Varka. However, Duran is only able to do this in vaporized teams with Mona. If Nicole does personal damage from off-field, then suddenly she runs the risk of stealing Duran's vaporized reactions if you use Nicole with on-field hypercarry Duran. This would keep Duran's on-field playstyle in check by not buffing it too much. Although, to be perfectly honest, on-field hypercarry Duran is probably already in a similar position as Varka, where it would prefer Bennett anyway, since, once again, Bennett would buff the on-fielder by more than Nicole, and Nicole's only benefit would be that she can buff the entire team, which on-field vaporized Duran doesn't really care that much about. Even so, giving Nicole her own off-field damage would still help keep her balanced so that she can mess with some reaction teams, making her even less desired for a character like Varka, while still keeping Nicole's crazy flexibility and universality as a wheelchair core with Duran, but also making her definitively the best in slot teammate of Varka. In short, here is what I think Nicole's kit could and should offer in order for her to buff Varka's team by enough for him to match our current top tier DPSs, while keeping Nicole a very healthy addition to the game who isn't restrictive to play, has a ton of very powerful teams, but isn't inflating the power of the DPSs who are already at the very top, like Varka. First, make Nicole buff the entire team's attack by around 1000, which is still less than Bennett's attack buff, with the difference being that Bennett can only buff the on-fielder, making Bennett still superior to Nicole in a decent amount of hypercarry teams that don't care about buffing the whole team. You could balance this number around her Hexarray requirement, as long as it's still a decent attack buff, even for non-Hexarray teams. Second, make Nicole a shielder or healer so that she can fulfill the sustain role in teams. Hexarray teams especially need a sustain unit, since none of the Hexarray characters can currently fulfill that role. And lastly, give Nicole personal damage similarly to Duran's personal damage to help contribute more to team DPS, and to allow Nicole and Duran to better match the current Columbina and Nefa wheelchair, while also making it harder to slot Nicole in some reaction teams, because her pyro application could steal, vaporize, or melt reactions for teams that care about those reactions. With a kit like this, Nicole would have the potential to buff Varka teams to being close to matching the current top teams without needing Varka's own personal damage to actually go through any more changes in the beta. She would be a very flexible unit thanks to her buffing and shielding, and would fit in a lot of teams, especially thanks to her synergy with Duran being very similar to the design philosophy behind the Columbina and Nefa duo. She would do all of this without breaking the game's balance, since Bennett is still better than her for Varka, and she's not raising the DPS ceiling of the game in any way. If anything, the only character she's mainly power creeping would be Toma, as a pyro shielder who offers a large team-wide attack buff and personal damage. Of course, all of this is mere speculation and theory crafting. While a kit like this is possible for Nicole and would fully justify Varka's current numbers without requiring Nicole to be a game-breaking character, it'll ultimately be up to Hoyo to decide how strong they want to make Varka's team in the end. As of currently, yes, Varka's team is below par, despite the fact that Varka does similar personal damage to Flynn's, and realistically, I think the only way to fix this is going to end up being through Nicole, because Varka's current damage would be perfectly fine if the rest of his team was as strong as Flynn's team, so he just needs one last puzzle piece to make that happen. All in all, it is very nerve-wracking as a Varka fan that the current state of his kit is sort of just waiting for Nicole to see how strong his team actually ends up performing. My main point with this video is just that Varka technically doesn't need higher numbers, and Nicole doesn't need to be the most insanely broken unit to ever release. As long as the synergy is anywhere near what I've theory crafted in this video, I think both Varka and Nicole will be perfectly balanced characters who are able to reach the DPS levels of current top teams, even with Varka in his current state, and even without making Nicole break the game. Of course, Varka requiring a very specific set of units is its own restriction, but that's sort of just the direction Hoyo is taking these days with DPS units and selling very specific team packages, so that's a different topic altogether. In short, Varka is not beyond saving, and even his own beta isn't going to tell the full story. Nicole could very much still save his current team DPS, and we're just going to have to wait out the first few weeks of Varka being underwhelming before we see what direction Hoyo takes with Nicole's kit. Hopefully it's at least somewhat similar to what I've speculated in this video, but until then, we will keep Varka in our prayers. Thank you so much for watching. I know the current Varka situation is pretty disheartening for a lot of people, but I wanted to offer a little bit of hope. A lot of people insist that Nicole can't possibly buff Varka to modern standards without being absurdly broken, but that isn't the case at all, and I really do hope that Nicole is able to be the character I want her to be, while also being able to help Varka be the character I want him to be as well. But only time will tell. Either way, doomed or not, I will be pulling for Varka no matter what. But I know a lot of people have been put off pulling Varka because of his current power level. Which side do you fall into? Are you still pulling Varka? And what are your thoughts on what I've proposed for Nicole's kit, and how she can still save Varka's team? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to like the video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. There will be plenty more videos just like this, especially when Nicole releases, so subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on all that. Thank you so much for watching, and with all of that said, until next time!